In the beginning, there was only water and sky, desert and dream. A world before monarchs, before pyramids, before the great stone faces that would one day gaze across millennia. The great river, not yet the sacred waterway of divine rulers, but simply water finding its ancient path through a realm of infinite sand. This is civilization's first breath, drawn somewhere around 5000 BC, when the mighty flood carved its valley deeper each year, leaving behind the black earth that would become the foundation of human greatness itself. Here, in scattered villages along the riverbank, people learned to read the water's moods, when it would rise, when it would fall, when it would bring life or threaten to take it away. The great waterway was everything. It was calendar and clock, highway and harvest, the thin green thread that divided the red desert from the black earth. The people who gathered along its banks called their realm Kemet, the Black Territory, for the rich soil that remained after each flood. Beyond lay Deshret, the Red Territory, an ocean of sand that stretched to the ends of the earth. In these early days, before writing, before history itself, communities grew slowly along the water's edge. At Hierakonpolis in the south, at Buto in the north, settlements became towns. Towns became centers of power. The people buried their dead facing west toward the setting sun, perhaps already sensing that the realm of the dead lay somewhere beyond the desert's burning horizon. They painted pictures on pottery, boats carrying the deceased, animals both real and mythical, dancers celebrating festivals we can no longer name. These images speak to us across 7,000 years, whispering of beliefs that would one day crystallize into the complex religious system of divine rulers. Even then, they sensed the sacred in the everyday, in the ibis that foretold the flood, in the falcon that soared high above the valley, in the bull whose strength could plow the black earth. Slowly, inevitably, the scattered communities began to coalesce. In Upper Kemet, the south, where the waterway ran between high cliffs, chieftains emerged who wore the white crown and ruled from Hierakonpolis. In Lower Kemet, the north, where the great streams spread into a vast delta before meeting the sea, rulers donned the red crown and held court in the delta cities. Two realms, two crowns, two ways of understanding the world, but both children of the same sacred flow. For centuries, these two kingdoms existed in uneasy balance, sometimes trading, sometimes warring, always aware of each other across the length of the sacred valley. The north was cosmopolitan, open to influences from across the Mediterranean. The south was more conservative, more traditionally Kemetic, guardian of customs that traced back to the waterway's earliest children. Then came the monarch, whose name echoes through history like thunder across water, Narmer, whom the Greeks would later call Menes, the unifier. Around 3100 BC, this southern ruler launched a campaign that would change the world forever. We see him on his victory pallet, a carved stone commemoration that ranks among humanity's earliest historical documents. Narmer in the white crown of Upper Kemet, striking down his enemies. Then Narmer in the red crown of Lower Kemet, master of both territories. The unification was not merely political, it was cosmic. For in joining the two territories, Narmer became something unprecedented in human history, a divine monarch, a living deity who embodied the harmony of opposites. He wore both crowns, commanded both peoples, and established a principle that would endure for 3,000 years, that this realm was one territory under one ruler, blessed by the divine forces and protected by the cosmic order they called Ma'at. Memphis rose where the two kingdoms met, at the junction of valley and delta. Here, Narmer, now calling himself Pharaoh, Great House, built his capital, a city that would endure longer than Rome, longer than Babylon, longer than any other seat of power in the ancient world. Memphis became the heart of the realm, the place where north met south, where the administrative genius of the divine monarchs first took shape. With unification came explosion, an eruption of human creativity and organizational power that seems almost miraculous. Within centuries of Narmer's conquest, the people had developed one of the world's first writing systems, hieroglyphs, sacred carvings that could capture not just practical information, but poetry, prayer, and philosophy. They created a calendar based on the flood cycle and the movement of the stars, dividing the year into 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 sacred days when the divine forces themselves were said to have been born. The early sovereigns of the first and second dynasties established the template of divine kingship that would endure for millennia. They were not merely rulers, but cosmic forces, responsible for maintaining the balance between order and chaos, civilization and wilderness, life and death. When they died, they did not simply perish. They were transformed, joining the sun deity Ra on his eternal journey across the sky. Their tombs grew larger, more elaborate, reflecting not vanity but profound religious conviction. At Saqqara, near Memphis, royal mastabas, bench-shaped monuments of mud brick and stone, housed not just the monarch's body, but everything he would need in the afterlife: food, furniture, even servants, who were sometimes buried alive to accompany their master into eternity. These early dynasties established the rhythms of Kemetic civilization, the annual flood that brought both renewal and anxiety, the careful recording of grain harvests and tax collections, the elaborate festivals that honored the divine forces and reinforced the sovereign's sacred authority. They developed the concept of divine kingship to its logical extreme. The pharaoh was Horus, the Vulcan deity, while he lived, and became Osiris, ruler of the dead, when he died. The bureaucracy that would become legendary for its efficiency began to take shape. Scribes, trained in the complex art of hieroglyphic writing, formed the backbone of the state. They recorded everything: the height of the flood, the amount of grain in the royal storehouses, the names of officials and their duties. This realm became perhaps the world's first truly literate civilization, where the written word carried the power of divine decree. Trade networks extended up the Great Waterway into Nubia, bringing gold, ivory, and exotic animals to the royal court. Eastward, they reached into the Sinai Peninsula for turquoise and copper. Northward, across the Mediterranean, they established contact with the emerging civilizations of Mesopotamia and Anatolia. The Black Territory was no isolated kingdom, but a confident power reaching out to touch the known world. The divine forces multiplied and organized themselves into a coherent pantheon. Ra, the sun deity, supreme but distant. Ptah, creator deity of Memphis, patron of craftsmen. Thoth, the ibis-headed deity of wisdom and writing. Hathor, the cow goddess of love and music. And overseeing all, the concept of Ma'at, not just a goddess, but a principle, the divine order that kept the universe functioning, that separated civilization from chaos, that made this realm what it was. Religious festivals marked the year's passage. The Opet festival, when Amun traveled from Karnak to Luxor, would not emerge for centuries yet, but already the people understood that the divine forces needed to journey, to be seen, to interact with their worshippers. The Siad festival, where the monarch renewed his divine power, may have begun in these early centuries, a ritualized death and rebirth that allowed rulers to reign for decades while remaining eternally young in cosmic terms. Art found its distinctive style early, the formal, hieratic approach that would characterize sculpture and painting for 3 millennia. Figures stood in eternal poses, men with left foot forward, women with feet together, both facing forward while their heads turned in profile. This was not primitive technique, but sophisticated theology, made visible. Kemetic art aimed not to capture a moment, but to ensure eternity. The concept of the afterlife, which would become central to this civilization, began to take its final form. Death was not ending, but transformation, not departure, but journey to a realm where the deserving could live forever in perfect happiness. The mummy, that most distinctive of all images, emerged from these early experiments with preservation, the desperate, loving attempt to keep the body intact so that the soul might recognize it in the next world. In the royal workshops of Memphis, craftsmen perfected techniques that would endure for millennia. They learned to work gold into intricate jewelry, to carve ivory into delicate figurines, to shape stone with a precision that spoke of divine inspiration. The palette of Nama itself demonstrates this artistic mastery. Every figure precisely carved, every symbol carefully placed, creating not just a record of victory, but a magical object that would ensure the monarch's triumph throughout eternity. The early sovereigns understood something profound about power. It must be both seen and felt, both earthly and cosmic. Ruler Jer of the First Dynasty created elaborate funeral games where hundreds of retainers were buried alongside him, their bodies arranged in neat rows around his tomb like sleeping courtiers attending their master's eternal rest. These were not acts of cruelty, but expressions of cosmic order. In death, as in life, the sovereign remained the center around which all else revolved. The great waterway itself became codified, measured, predicted. Priests at Memphis began keeping careful records of the flood's height, noting which years brought prosperity and which brought famine. They discovered the waterway's secret rhythm, that it rose not according to the vagaries of weather, but in harmony with the stars themselves. When Sirius, the dog star, appeared on the eastern horizon just before dawn, the flood would follow within days. Here was proof that heaven and earth moved in concert, that the divine forces themselves orchestrated the annual rebirth. Language itself became sacred. The hieroglyphs that began as simple pictures, a bird for a bird, a house for a house, evolved into something far more sophisticated, a writing system that could capture not just objects, but ideas, sounds, abstract concepts. The scribes discovered that symbols could represent not just what they showed, but what they sounded like, and thus began the complex interplay of ideogram and phonogram that would make this writing both beautiful and bewilderingly complex. These early scribes, trained in schools attached to temples and palaces, became the realm's memory keepers. They recorded not just the practical affairs of state, but the wisdom of the ages, instructions for proper conduct, hymns to the divine forces, stories of heroes and monsters. The instruction of Ptahhotep, though written later, preserves wisdom that surely echoes back to these earliest literate generations. Be skilled in speech so that you will succeed. The tongue of a person is their sword. An effective speech is stronger than all fighting. In the villages along the great waterway, life took on the rhythms that would persist for 3,000 years. Farmers learned to read the water's moods, to plant when the waters receded, to harvest before the next flood came. They developed the shaduf, the ingenious lever system that could lift water from the stream to irrigate fields that lay beyond the flood's natural reach. They domesticated the sacred animals that would become central to religious practice, cattle whose strength pulled the plough, cats who protected the grain stores from rats, dogs who guarded homes and accompanied hunters into the desert. The villages themselves reflected cosmic order. Houses faced north to catch the cooling breeze, their flat roofs serving as workspaces and sleeping areas during the hot months. Streets aligned with cardinal directions, as if the earth itself were a sacred diagram. Markets bustled with goods from across the known world: cedar wood from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, gold from the mysterious territories far up the Great Waterway, where black-skinned people mined the metal from veins in granite hills. Religious practices multiplied and intertwined. The cow goddess Hathor, later so beloved throughout the realm, may have emerged from these early farming communities where cattle meant survival. The falcon deity Horus, patron of monarchs, surely grew from the awe that desert people felt watching these magnificent predators soar above the valley. Local deities, protective spirits of particular places, gradually organized themselves into a coherent pantheon as political unification demanded religious unity. The royal tombs at Abydos tell their own story of evolving beliefs. The earliest are simple pit graves, distinguished from commoners' burials mainly by their size and the richness of their grave goods. But gradually they become more elaborate, lined with wood, then brick, then stone, divided into chambers for different purposes, surrounded by subsidiary burials of servants, pets, and precious objects. Each generation of tomb builders reached a little higher, dreamed a little grander, as if sensing that their constructions were rehearsals for something magnificent yet to come. The sovereign's regalia crystallized into symbols that would endure unchanged for millennia. The double crown, combining the white crown of Upper Kemet with the red crown of Lower Kemet, proclaimed his dominion over both territories. The crook and flail, borrowed from shepherds and farmers, declared him guardian of his people. The false beard, tied on with ribbons, connected him to the divine forces who were always depicted as bearded. The Uraeus cobra on his brow promised death to his enemies and protection to his subjects. Mystery cults began to emerge around certain deities. Osiris, the dying and resurrecting deity who would become central to religious practice, may already have had devotees in these early centuries. The myth that would later explain his death at the hands of his brother Set, his dismemberment and scattering across the realm, and his resurrection through the love of his wife Isis, surely grew from older stories about the annual death and rebirth of vegetation, about the eternal struggle between order and chaos, fertility and sterility, life and death. Trade routes extended like arteries from the heartland. To the south, expeditions pushed up the Great Waterway beyond the First Cataract into Nubia, returning with gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animals for the royal menageries. To the northeast, caravans crossed the Sinai Peninsula to bring back turquoise from ancient mines and copper from Timna. To the north, ships sailed the Mediterranean, establishing the first contacts with the emerging civilizations of the Aegean and Anatolia. The bureaucracy that would become the realm's most distinctive feature began to take shape. Officials with titles that would persist for millennia: Chief of the Royal Seal, Overseer of the Royal Treasury, High Priest of Ptah, established departments and procedures that brought order to an increasingly complex state. Provincial governors, responsible for tax collection and local administration, created the first version of the famous administrative efficiency. By the end of the early dynastic period, around 2700 BC, this civilization had become recognizably itself, a unified kingdom stretching from the First Cataract to the Mediterranean, ruled by divine monarchs, sustained by the annual gift of life, organized by an increasingly sophisticated bureaucracy, protected by the cosmic order of Mawat. But human ambition, once awakened, knows no bounds. The sovereigns who inherited this carefully ordered world would soon discover that stone and geometry, properly combined, could touch the imperishable stars themselves. The third dynasty dawned with a revolution written in stone. Around 2670 BC, a ruler named Djoser ascended to power, but it was his architect who would change the world forever. Imhotep, physician, astronomer, sage, and master builder, stood before his sovereign with plans that defied every convention of royal burial. No longer would the divine leader rest beneath a simple mastaba. Instead, he would ascend to heaven on a stairway of stone. At Saqqara, across the waterway from Memphis, Imhotep began construction of something unprecedented, a stepped monument rising in 6 massive tiers toward the sky. Each level represented progress closer to the divine realm, a physical manifestation of the celestial ladder that would carry the deceased ruler to join Ra in his solar bark. The step monument complex was more than a tomb. It was a miniature cosmos rendered in limestone. Courtyards for the eternal celebration of the CD festival. Chambers filled with provisions for the afterlife. False doors through which the sovereign spirit could pass between worlds. For the first time in human history, someone had attempted to construct eternity itself. But Imhotep's masterpiece was only the beginning. His innovation unleashed an architectural fever that would consume the fourth lineage and create wonders that still inspire awe 4.5 millennia later. The challenge had been set. Each new ruler must reach higher, grander, more perfectly than his predecessor. The first sovereign of the fourth lineage inherited this ambition and made it his obsession. Sneferu embarked on a construction program so vast it defies comprehension. At Maidum, he completed a stepped monument begun by his predecessor, then transformed it into the first true geometric form by filling in the steps with smooth limestone casing. But the angles were wrong, the weight distribution flawed. Parts of the structure collapsed, earning it the modern name, the Collapsed Monument. Undeterred, Sneferu moved north to Dashur and began again. His second attempt rose at a sharp angle of 54 degrees, but halfway up, the builders realized their mistake. The angle was too steep. The structure would collapse under its own weight. They changed course mid-construction, reducing the angle to 43 degrees, creating the distinctive bent profile that gives the monument its name. Still not satisfied, Sneferu commissioned a third monument at Dashur, the red structure named for the reddish limestone of its core. Here, finally, the builders achieved perfection. The angle was ideal, the construction flawless. The first true geometric monument stood complete, its smooth sides catching the desert sun like a geometric mountain crafted by the divine forces themselves. Sneferu's son inherited not just a throne, but a challenge that seemed impossible to surpass. How could any structure exceed the magnificence of his father's achievements? Khufu's answer would become one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. At Giza, on a plateau overlooking the ancient capital, Khufu's architects laid out plans for a monument that would dwarf all others. For over 20 years, perhaps 30,000 workers labored to create the great monument. Massive limestone blocks, each weighing as much as 15 tons, were quarried from the Giza plateau itself. The finest white limestone came from Tura, across the waterway, ferried by barges during the annual flood. Granite for the inner chambers traveled 600 miles down the great waterway from Aswan, massive blocks that required specially constructed vessels to transport. The precision of the great structure borders on the supernatural. Its base covers 13 acres and is level to within just 2 centimeters. The 4 sides align almost perfectly with the cardinal directions, deviating by only 3 arc minutes. The monument's height, originally 481 feet, related to its base by the mathematical constant pi, though whether this was intentional or coincidental, remains one of Egyptology's enduring mysteries. Inside, the architects created a complex of chambers and passageways that speaks to both practical needs and cosmic symbolism. The descending passage plunges into the bedrock toward an unfinished subterranean chamber, perhaps the original burial site, abandoned when plans changed. The ascending passage leads to the Grand Gallery, a soaring corridor with a corbelled ceiling that ranks among the masterpieces of ancient architecture. At its end lies the royal chamber, constructed entirely of red granite and housing a massive sarcophagus that was placed there during construction, too large to fit through the passages once the monument was complete. The great structure was not merely Khufu's tomb, but the centerpiece of an entire necropolis. The complex included a mortuary temple where daily offerings would be made to the deceased ruler's spirit, a causeway connecting the monument to a valley temple where the mummification rituals were performed, and smaller structures for Khufu's queens. Surrounding the main monument, hundreds of mastaba tombs housed the nobles and officials who would serve their sovereign in the afterlife, creating an eternal city of the dead. But even Khufu's achievement could not satisfy the architectural ambitions of the 4th lineage. His son, Khafra, constructed the 2nd monument at Giza, slightly smaller than his father's, but appearing taller because it stands on higher ground. Khafra also commissioned the Great Sphinx, carved from a massive outcrop of limestone left by his father's quarrying operations. With the body of a lion and the head of a ruler, the Sphinx embodies the concept of divine leadership, the wisdom of humanity combined with the strength of the mightiest predator. Menkaure, Khafra's successor, completed the Giza trilogy with a 3rd monument, smaller than its companions but no less carefully constructed. By now, the enormous expense of these projects was straining even the vast resources of the most powerful state on Earth. The royal structure remained massive, but the complex was simpler, the subsidiary buildings less elaborate. These monuments were not constructed by slaves, despite popular imagination. Recent archaeological evidence from the workers' villages at Giza reveals that the laborers were well-fed craftsmen, probably conscripted during the flood season when farming was impossible. They consumed massive quantities of beef, bread, and beer, a diet that speaks to their valued status rather than oppression. Graffiti left by work gangs bears proud names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure, suggesting a sense of pride in their monumental achievement. The geometric complexes functioned as economic engines that employed thousands of people year-round. Priests maintained daily rituals, offering food and incense to the deceased ruler's spirit. Craftsmen created the furniture, jewelry, and provisions needed for the afterlife. Farmers on royal estates provided the agricultural surplus that funded these activities. These monuments were not testaments to royal vanity, but religious and economic institutions that sustained entire communities. During this golden age, divine leadership reached its apex. The sovereign was not merely ruler, but cosmic principle, the living embodiment of Horus who would become Osiris upon death. The sacred texts, first carved in the burial chamber of Unas at the end of the 5th lineage, preserve the religious beliefs that animated these monuments. They speak of the deceased ruler ascending to heaven, joining the imperishable stars, becoming one with Ra on his eternal journey across the sky. The nobles who surrounded these divine leaders constructed their own elaborate tombs, creating an art form that would influence civilization for millennia. The mastaba tombs at Saqqara and Giza are decorated with scenes of daily life rendered in exquisite detail. Farmers harvesting grain, fishermen casting nets, craftsmen at their benches, dancers and musicians entertaining guests at banquets. These images were not mere decoration, but magical insurance, ensuring that the deceased would enjoy these pleasures throughout eternity. Women enjoyed remarkable status during the Old Kingdom. Queen Hetepheres, Khufu's mother, was buried with furniture and jewelry of extraordinary craftsmanship. The gold work found in her tomb demonstrates a level of artistic achievement that would not be surpassed for centuries. Other royal women, like Queen Kenkawes, may have ruled in their own right during transitional periods between successive lineages. The administrative system that supported this monumental age was a marvel of efficiency. The Abusir papyri, discovered in the complex of Neferefre, provide the earliest substantial administrative archives from ancient times. They reveal a bureaucracy of extraordinary sophistication, tracking everything from the daily rations of temple workers to the movements of ships carrying stone from distant quarries. Officials with titles like Overseer of all royal works and Chief Architect commanded resources that dwarfed those of most contemporary kingdoms. Science and mathematics flourished alongside architecture. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, though copied much later, preserves medical knowledge that likely dates to this period. The first systematic description of surgical procedures, anatomical observations, and rational medical thinking. The Rind Papyrus demonstrates mathematical concepts, including the beginnings of geometry and algebra, that the monument creators must have mastered to achieve their architectural miracles. Trade networks expanded to support the construction programs. Cedar wood from Lebanon provided the timber for boats and scaffolding. Gold from Nubia funded the vast expenses. Copper from Sinai was alloyed with tin to create bronze tools that made precise stone cutting possible. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan decorated royal jewelry, while incense from Punt perfumed temple rituals. Religious concepts crystallized during this period that would remain central to belief for 3,000 years. The sun deity Ra emerged as the supreme divine force, the creator and sustainer of all life. The deceased ruler was thought to join Ra's crew on the solar bark, helping to fight off the serpent Apophis, who threatened to devour the sun each night. This daily cosmic drama was reflected in the orientation of temples and monuments, aligned to catch the first rays of dawn. But even the mightiest kingdoms contain the seeds of their own decline. The enormous resources devoted to monumental construction gradually weakened the central government. Provincial governors, grown wealthy from managing the royal estates, began to assert increasing independence. The ideology of divine leadership, taken to its logical extreme, paradoxically weakened royal power by making the sovereign too sacred for effective political action. The fifth lineage marked the beginning of this slow decline. The stone monuments grew smaller, the construction less precise. Solar temples, dedicated to Ra, began to compete with royal tombs for resources and attention. The divine ruler was still revered, but power was slowly diffusing to the priesthood and provincial nobility. Pepi II, who ascended the throne as a child around 2278 BC, would rule for 94 years, the longest reign in human history. But longevity proved a curse rather than a blessing. As the aged sovereign became increasingly isolated in his palace, real power shifted to regional governors who ruled their provinces like independent kingdoms. The central government, weakened by decades of massive construction projects and lavish court life, could no longer enforce its authority over distant territories. Climate change compounded political weakness. The annual flood, the foundation of prosperity, began to fail. Drought gripped the region, causing famine and social unrest. Provincial governors hoarded grain, while the central government proved powerless to redistribute resources effectively. The unified realm that had stood for over 5 centuries began to fragment. As Pepi II's endless reign finally ended, the last vestiges of central authority crumbled with him. Provincial warlords declared independence. Memphis emptied as courtiers fled to their home districts, and the great monuments stood silent, their daily rituals abandoned. The age of divine sovereigns was over. Chaos was about to be born. The collapse came not with fire and sword, but with the simple failure of water to rise. For 7 years in succession, the life-giving flood barely reached the banks of the great waterway. Fields that had known fertility for millennia turned to dust. Granaries built to last through normal lean years emptied and stayed empty. The divine order that had sustained civilization for 8 centuries cracked like sun-baked clay. In the villages, people began to die. First the elderly, then the children, finally the strong young farmers, who had always seemed as eternal as the monuments themselves. The provincial governors, grown fat on the tribute that had once flowed to Memphis, hoarded what grain remained. Trade routes emptied as merchants found nothing to buy and no one able to pay. The bureaucrats who had recorded every basket of wheat and every jar of oil found themselves with nothing left to count. Memphis, the eternal capital, became a ghost city. The great palace where divine rulers had held court for centuries echoed with the footsteps of servants who would soon abandon their posts. The workshops that had created treasures for royal tombs fell silent. The priests who had maintained daily rituals in temple after temple found their altars bare of offerings. Even the gods, it seemed, had abandoned their chosen people. But nature's cruelty only revealed the deeper rot that had been spreading through the kingdom's foundations. The old kingdom had not merely collapsed, it had devoured itself. Decades of monumental construction had drained the treasury, leaving no reserves for crisis. The ideology of divine leadership had grown so rigid that rulers could no longer adapt to changing circumstances. Most fatally, power had drained away from the center to regional strongmen, who owed their positions to royal favor, but felt no loyalty to royal authority. When central government finally disappeared, these provincial governors simply declared themselves independent rulers. The unified realm shattered into dozens of petty kingdoms, each controlling a few districts along the waterway. They fought constant wars over irrigation rights, trade routes, and the dwindling resources of a land in crisis. Some called themselves pharaohs, commissioning crude monuments and pathetic imitations of royal regalia. Others abandoned all pretense and ruled as simple warlords. The sacred order that had made civilization possible evaporated. Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth, justice, and harmony, seemed to have fled the world entirely. Ancient texts from this period preserve the horror of those who lived through civilization's collapse. The land spins around, as does a potter's wheel. Towns are destroyed, and Upper Kemet has become wasteland. Crocodiles gorge on the fish they have caught, and people go to them of their own accord. Even more shocking than political chaos was social revolution. The rigid hierarchies that had defined society for centuries dissolved overnight. Servants claimed their master's property. Peasants wore fine linen, while nobles dressed in rags. The careful burial customs that had distinguished rich from poor disappeared as surviving communities could barely afford to bury their dead at all. let alone with the elaborate provisions that had once guaranteed eternal comfort. Yet in this apparent ending lay the seeds of rebirth. The collapse of central authority forced local communities to become self-reliant in ways they had never been before. Village councils learned to make decisions without royal approval. Local craftsmen developed new techniques when luxury materials became unavailable. Farmers experimented with crops and irrigation methods when the old systems failed. The catastrophe that destroyed the old order also unleashed human creativity on an unprecedented scale. Writing itself was democratized. Hieroglyphic literacy, once the exclusive preserve of royal scribes, spread to provincial officials and local priests who needed to record their own affairs. More revolutionary still was the development of hieratic script, a simplified cursive form of hieroglyphs that could be written quickly on papyrus or pottery shards. For the first time, ordinary people could learn to read and write. Religious beliefs underwent their own transformation. The coffin texts, magical spells that had once been carved only in royal burial chambers, began appearing in the tombs of provincial nobles and wealthy merchants. Death and resurrection, previously the exclusive privilege of divine rulers, became democratized. Anyone who could afford proper mummification and burial equipment could hope to join Osiris in the blessed afterlife. Literature flourished as scribes recorded not royal propaganda, but their own experiences of living through apocalyptic times. The prophecy of Neferti described a land turned upside down, where brothers will fight brothers and the children will kill their parents. The dialogue of a man with his soul explored the meaning of life when all traditional certainties had vanished. These works reveal sophisticated philosophical thinking that the rigid conventions of the Old Kingdom had never permitted. For nearly a century and a half, this chaotic new world persisted. Dozens of rulers, calling themselves pharaohs, ruled territories no larger than individual provinces of the former kingdom. Some lasted years, others mere months, before falling to rivals or succumbing to the ongoing environmental crisis. Archaeological evidence suggests that many regions were virtually abandoned as populations fled to areas where water and food remained available. But gradually, stronger powers emerged from the confusion. In Heracleopolis, north of Thebes, a family of rulers calling themselves the 9th and 10th dynasties managed to control substantial territory in middle and lower regions. They restored some administrative efficiency, rebuilt irrigation systems, and even commissioned modest monuments in imitation of their great predecessors. More significant was the rise of a noble family in Thebes, who would eventually reunify the entire realm. These 11th dynasty rulers started as simple provincial governors, but possessed something their rivals lacked: a coherent vision of what restoration meant. They understood that reunification required not just military conquest, but the reconstruction of the administrative, religious, and cultural systems that had made the Old Kingdom great. Mentuhotep II, greatest of the Theban rulers, spent 50 years slowly extending his authority northward. Unlike the warlords who had dominated the intermediate period, he campaigned not merely to conquer territory, but to restore the ancient systems of governance. As each district submitted to his authority, he appointed competent administrators, rebuilt temples, restored irrigation networks, and re-established the trade connections that brought prosperity. The final battle came at Heracleopolis, where the last of the northern dynasties made their stand. When the city fell, Mentuhotep stood as undisputed master of the entire waterway from the first cataract to the Mediterranean. For the first time in over a century, the two lands were truly united under a single ruler. The Middle Kingdom had begun. But this restoration was no simple return to old ways. The traumatic experience of collapse had changed everything. The new rulers understood that divine authority alone was insufficient. Effective government required capable administrators, loyal armies, and the genuine support of local communities. They created a more flexible system that combined central control with regional autonomy. Mentuhotep's successors, beginning with Amenemhet I, established the 12th dynasty and moved the capital north to a new city called Itij-Tawi, Caesar of the Two Lands. Strategically located between Memphis and the Fayum oasis. From here, they could control both the traditional heartland and the newly developed agricultural regions that would fund the kingdom's renaissance. Amenemhet I ruled for 30 years, but met a violent end that shocked the realm. His assassination, apparently by palace conspirators, demonstrated that even successful rulers remained vulnerable to the ambitions of rivals. Before his death, he composed the Instructions of Amenemhet, a bitter testament warning his son that trust no brother, know no friend, make no intimates. The optimism of the Old Kingdom, when pharaohs were unquestioned gods, had given way to a more cynical understanding of power's limitations. His son, Senusret I, learned the lesson well. He ruled for 45 years, extending the kingdom's borders deep into Nubia, while maintaining careful control over potential rivals at home. The great fortress he built at Buan, far up the waterway beyond the Second Cataract, demonstrated the new militaristic spirit of the Middle Kingdom. These rulers would not merely rule from their palaces, but would actively campaign to expand their territory and secure their borders. Senusret III, greatest military leader of the dynasty, pushed even farther south, establishing a fortified frontier at Semna beyond the Second Cataract. His propaganda was blunt and threatening. Any son of mine who shall maintain this frontier, which my majesty has made, he is my son. But he who shall abandon it and shall not fight for it, he is not my son. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs understood something their Old Kingdom predecessors had forgotten, that power required constant vigilance and occasional violence to maintain. They were divine rulers, but they were also practical politicians who could not afford to retreat into sacred isolation. They campaigned personally with their armies, supervised major construction projects, and maintained close relationships with provincial governors who might otherwise develop dangerous independence. Literature and art flourished under these conditions. The story of Sinuhe, greatest of Middle Kingdom tales, tells of a court official who flees the realm after Amenemhet I's assassination, but eventually returns to find redemption and royal favor. It reveals a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and political complexity that the formal propaganda of earlier periods had never achieved. Religious developments proved equally significant. Amun, originally a minor Theban deity, began his rise to become the supreme god of the realm. His priests, grateful for the Theban dynasty's success, promoted his worship throughout the newly unified kingdom. By the end of the Middle Kingdom, Amun had merged with Ra to become Amun-Ra, king of gods and patron of pharaohs. The irrigation systems developed during this period transformed agriculture forever. The Fayum oasis, southwest of Memphis, was converted from a swampland into the kingdom's most productive farming region through an ingenious system of canals and dikes. Similar projects throughout the valley increased agricultural production and supported larger populations than ever before. But perhaps the most important change was social. The rigid class distinctions of the Old Kingdom gave way to greater mobility and opportunity. Provincial families could rise to high office through merit rather than birth. Skilled craftsmen and scribes formed a genuine middle class with their own cultural traditions and economic interests. Even farmers enjoyed greater security as the new administrative systems provided more reliable protection against famine and oppression. For over 2 centuries, this restored kingdom flourished. Trade networks reached into Nubia for gold, into the Levant for cedar wood and luxury goods, across the Red Sea to the mysterious land of Punt for incense and exotic animals. The capital at Itje Tawi became a cosmopolitan center where foreign merchants and diplomats mingled with local officials and priests. Yet success contained its own dangers. As the Middle Kingdom grew wealthy and secure, its rulers began to lose the military edge that had made reunification possible. The 13th dynasty produced competent administrators, but no great warriors. Provincial governors, grown comfortable in their hereditary positions, began to care more about local interests than royal commands. Most ominously, the kingdom's very success attracted new peoples to its borders. In the Delta, Asiatic traders and craftsmen established permanent settlements. At first, these immigrants seemed beneficial. They brought new technologies and trade connections that increased prosperity. But as their numbers grew and their communities became more established, they began to develop their own political ambitions. The great waterway that had once protected the realm from foreign invasion now carried new threats toward its heart. The age of isolation was ending, though few yet realized it. The kingdom that had been reborn from chaos would soon face challenges that would test whether any lessons had truly been learned from the catastrophe that had nearly destroyed civilization itself. The great waterway that had once united a mighty realm now divided a broken land. By the 17th century before Christ, the restoration achieved by Amenemhest, the third's successors had already begun to crumble. The 13th lineage produced over 60 leaders in little more than a century. A parade of forgotten names, each reigning barely long enough to carve his cartouche before disappearing into obscurity. In the north, around Memphis and the rich floodplains, a shadow administration emerged. The 14th lineage, if it can even be called that, consisted of local strongmen who controlled individual cities or small districts. They bore royal titles but commanded no armies, controlled no trade routes, possessed no legitimacy beyond the walls of their own settlements. The unified state that had endured for over a millennium had become a patchwork of petty territories. Into this vacuum came strangers from the east. They called themselves Heka Kasut, masters of foreign lands, but history knows them by the Greek corruption of that title, the Asiatic dynasties. These were not the barbarian hordes of later imagination, but sophisticated people from the Levant, traders and craftsmen who had been filtering into the northern regions for generations. What made them revolutionary was not their culture, but their technology. They brought the horse. For 3,000 years, the mightiest army in the known world had been an infantry force armed with copper weapons and simple bows. Chariots were unknown, cavalry unimaginable. The Asiatic invaders changed warfare forever. Their horse-drawn chariots, armed with composite bows that could pierce armor at distances local archers had never dreamed possible, transformed the battlefield into a killing ground where mobility meant survival and tradition meant death. The invasion, when it came, was less dramatic than the later propaganda would suggest. No great battles decided the fate of territories. Instead, Asiatic chiefs simply declared themselves masters of regions that had no effective defenders. Local populations, exhausted by decades of civil war and administrative chaos, often welcomed new overlords who could restore order and prosperity. Salitis, the first foreign chieftain to claim dominion over lower territories, established his capital at Avaris in the eastern floodplains. Here, Syrian merchants had traded for generations, creating a cosmopolitan city where traditional temples stood beside Canaanite shrines, where local artisans learned foreign techniques, where the ancient and the innovative merged in ways that would have horrified the builders of the monuments at Giza. The Cultural Revolution was as profound as the military one. Bronze replaced copper in tools and weapons. The potter's wheel, long known but little used, became standard equipment in workshops throughout the north. New crops, pomegranates, olive trees, horses' fodder, transformed agriculture. Even music changed as Asiatic lyres and lutes joined the traditional harps and flutes in temple orchestras. But the foreign dynasties faced a fundamental problem that would ultimately destroy them. They could conquer the north, but they could never truly govern it. The bureaucratic traditions, the religious practices, the very concept of divine leadership that made administration possible in this land remained alien to them. They adopted traditional titles, commissioned monuments in ancient styles, even learned to write hieroglyphs, but they remained outsiders, attempting to master a civilization whose deepest assumptions they could not fully grasp. In Thebes, far up the sacred waterway, where foreign chariots could not easily penetrate, the ancient nobility watched and waited. Here, descendants of the Middle Phase maintained the fiction that they were the legitimate sovereigns of all territories, though their authority rarely extended beyond the city walls. They called themselves the 17th lineage and performed the ancient rituals in reduced temples with diminished resources, keeping alive the memory of unified governance. For over a century, this uneasy balance persisted. The foreign dynasties controlled the rich northern territories and the trade routes to Asia. Theban leaders maintained traditional authority in the south. Between them, local chieftains carved out small domains, changing allegiances as circumstances demanded. It was a time of cultural flowering and political fragmentation, when new ideas circulated freely, but no single authority could impose order on the chaos. Then came the message that would ignite a war lasting generations. Apophis, mightiest of the foreign overlords, sent an embassy to Thebes bearing an impossible demand. The hippopotamuses in the sacred pool of the Theban palace, he claimed, were keeping him awake at night with their roaring, despite the fact that 600 miles separated Avaris from Thebes. The message was clearly an insult, a deliberate provocation designed to force the Theban sovereign into a humiliating acknowledgement of foreign supremacy. Sekenenre-Ta, the Theban chieftain, chose war instead. The archaeological evidence of his decision lies in the museum in Cairo. Sekenenre's mummy, bearing the wounds that killed him. His skull was crushed by a foreign battle axe, his jaw shattered by a mace, his neck pierced by a dagger. He died violently, probably in battle, the first casualty of a liberation war that would consume 3 generations. His son Kamose inherited both throne and vendetta. The young leader launched campaigns against foreign positions, pushing north from Thebes with a fleet of warboats. His victory stela, discovered at Karnak, preserves his own words describing the destruction of Asiatic settlements. I sailed north to drive out the foreigners by the command of Amun, my courage being firm against them. My army was like lions with their prey, slaves, cattle, milk, fat, and honey, dividing up their possessions. But Kamose's campaigns, though successful, were merely raids. He could strike at foreign territories and withdraw, but he lacked the resources to hold conquered ground. The fundamental problem remained: how could a southern territory, cut off from the Mediterranean trade that had always been the source of royal wealth, hope to defeat enemies who controlled the richest regions and possess superior military technology? The answer came with Kamosi's younger brother, Ahmose, who would become the founder of the most glorious age in all of ancient history. Ahmose understood that beating the invaders required becoming like them. He adopted their military innovations, chariots, composite bows, bronze weapons, while maintaining the religious and administrative traditions that gave his governance legitimacy. More importantly, he grasped that the war could not be won through raids, but only through systematic conquest and the complete destruction of foreign authority. The siege of Avaris became the defining moment of the Liberation War. For years, Ahmose's forces surrounded the foreign capital, cutting off trade routes and supplies. Inside the city, Asiatic families who had called the northern territories home for generations faced a terrible choice: flee to their ancestral lands in the Levant, or face the vengeance of the returning traditional forces. When Avaris finally fell, Ahmose's treatment of the defeated population set the pattern for the new age that was dawning. Unlike previous conquerors who had been content to govern through local allies, he expelled the foreign leadership entirely, pursuing them even into their Palestinian strongholds to ensure they could never return. The message was clear: alien dominance would never again be tolerated in the sacred valley. But the victory brought unexpected consequences. The armies that had learned to fight in foreign lands discovered that conquest could be profitable. The weapons designed to expel invaders proved equally effective at creating an empire. The administrative skills developed to govern a reunified state could manage distant provinces as easily as local districts. The pharaoh who had begun as a defender of ancient traditions found himself the founder of an imperial age. The chariots that had once threatened Thebes now carried traditional warriors beyond the ancestral borders into Nubia and the Levant, establishing an empire that would stretch from the Fourth Cataract to the Euphrates. The foreign period, traumatic as it had been, had transformed everything. The isolated territory that had once believed itself the center of a static universe had become an aggressive imperial force, confident in its military superiority and determined never again to suffer the humiliation of alien domination. The weapons, tactics, and technologies learned from enemies had made the ancient realm stronger than it had ever been. As Ahmose stood in the ruins of Avaris, surrounded by the spoils of victory, he could hardly have imagined that he had unleashed forces that would make his successors the most formidable sovereigns on earth. The age of isolation was ending. The age of empire was about to begin. The victory at Avaris had been more than military triumph. It was transformation. Ahmose, who began his reign fighting to expel foreign invaders, ended it as conqueror of distant lands. The defensive war that drove out the Asiatic dynasties became an offensive campaign that pushed traditional forces deep into Nubia and the Levant. By his death, around 1525, the isolated valley civilization had become an aggressive, expansionist power, stretching from the Fourth Cataract to the borders of Mesopotamia. His son, Amenhotep I, consolidated these early conquests, but it was the third sovereign of the 18th lineage who truly established the template of international greatness. Thutmose I, ascending to the throne through marriage rather than birth, felt compelled to prove his legitimacy through military achievement. His campaigns reached farther than any previous expedition, south beyond the Third Cataract into the heart of Nubia, north across the Euphrates into the Mitanni heartland. At Tombos, near the Third Cataract, Thutmose carved an inscription that reveals the new expansionist mentality. "I have made the boundaries of my dominion as far as that which the sun encircles." No longer content to rule the sacred valley, these sovereigns claimed dominion over the entire known world. The modest defensiveness of earlier ages gave way to boundless ambition, backed by military technology that made such dreams achievable. But the most remarkable leader of this early expansionist age wore no beard, carried no mace, and never led an army into battle. When Thutmose II died young, leaving only a male heir who was still a child, his principal wife assumed the regency with traditional female authority. What made Hatshepsut extraordinary was not that she ruled as regent, royal women had done so before, but that she gradually transformed herself into something unprecedented, a female pharaoh. The process was gradual, almost imperceptible. Early inscriptions show her standing behind the young Thutmose III, clearly identified as regent. Later images show them side by side as co-rulers. Finally, Hatshepsut appears alone, wearing the false beard and royal regalia of divine sovereignty, while Thutmose III disappears entirely from official records. For 15 years, she ruled as absolute monarch, and the vast territories not only survived but flourished. Hatshepsut's genius lay in understanding that successful expansionism required more than military conquest. While her predecessors had seized territories through force, she consolidated them through trade, diplomacy, and magnificent construction projects that demonstrated the realm's wealth and sophistication. Her trading expedition to Punt, immortalized in reliefs at Deir el-Bahri, brought back gold, ivory, incense trees, and exotic animals that showcased the kingdom's international connections. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri ranks among the architectural masterpieces of the ancient world. Built into the cliffs of the western bank, its terraced design harmonizes perfectly with the natural landscape, while creating spaces of breathtaking beauty. The temple was not merely a monument to royal vanity, but a statement of expansionist ideology, that the sovereign's divine nature could transform even the harsh desert into a paradise of ordered beauty. But Hatshepsut's peaceful reign was an aberration in an age of constant warfare. When Thutmose III finally assumed sole authority around 1479, he revealed himself as the greatest military genius in the kingdom's history. For the next 3 decades, he campaigned almost continuously, transforming the loose collection of tributaries he inherited into a tightly controlled international system. The Battle of Megiddo, fought in his 22nd regnal year, demonstrated both his tactical brilliance and the new reality of ancient warfare. The coalition of Canaanite cities that had rebelled against traditional authority possessed armies, equipped with the same bronze weapons and horse-drawn chariots that had once made the Asiatic dynasties invincible. But Thutmose's forces had learned those lessons and improved upon them. His composite bows had greater range, his chariots were more maneuverable, and his infantry formations were more disciplined than anything his enemies could field. More importantly, Thutmose understood that victory in battle meant nothing without systematic follow-up. After crushing the enemy coalition at Megiddo, he besieged the city for 7 months, ensuring that its surrender was complete and final. The wealth captured in that single campaign, 924 chariots, 2,238 horses, 200 suits of armor, and countless weapons, funded further expeditions and demonstrated to potential rebels the futility of resistance. The administrative system that managed this vast international network was a marvel of ancient organization. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence discovered in the ruins of Akhenaten's capital, reveal an international world of unprecedented complexity. Letters arrive from the leaders of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and the Hittite state, addressing the monarch as brother and negotiating marriages, trade agreements, and territorial disputes. Local governors from Palestinian and Syrian cities write desperate pleas for military assistance against raiders or rival administrators. This correspondence reveals that control over distant territories was never automatic, but required constant attention and occasional armed intervention. Provincial governors, many of them local chiefs who had submitted to traditional authority, constantly tested the limits of their autonomy. Nomadic peoples raided settled territories when forces were distracted elsewhere. Rival powers, particularly the rising Hittite state, actively encouraged rebellion in border regions. Amenhotep II, Thutmose III's son, inherited this complex system and maintained it through a combination of diplomatic skill and brutal suppression of rebellion. His victory stela at Karnak boasts of executing 7 captured princes with his own hand, then hanging their bodies from the walls of Thebes and Napata to discourage future resistance. Such displays of royal justice were not mere cruelty, but calculated political theatre designed to maintain order across vast distances. The wealth that flowed into Thebes from these conquests transformed the ancient capital into the most magnificent city in the world. Karnak Temple, already impressive, became a vast complex of sanctuaries, courtyards, and monuments that covered over 200 acres. The annual Opet festival, when the god Amun journeyed from Karnak to Luxor Temple, became a celebration of international glory that attracted visitors from across the known world. Amenhotep III, ascending to the throne around 1391, inherited a dominion at the height of its power and prosperity. His 38-year reign marked the golden age of ancient diplomacy and cultural achievement. The diplomatic correspondence from his era reveals a world where major powers maintained peace through carefully negotiated marriages, territorial agreements, and regular exchanges of gifts that were really disguised tribute payments. The wealth at Amenhotep III's disposal was almost beyond comprehension. Nubian gold mines provided a steady stream of the precious metal that financed massive construction projects and diplomatic gifts. The Malkata Palace complex, on the west bank at Thebes, covered an area larger than most contemporary cities and included artificial lakes for royal recreation. The mortuary temple he built for himself was the largest religious structure ever attempted, though only the famous Colossi of Memnon, 2 seated statues, each weighing 720 tons, survive today. But this prosperity contained the seeds of revolution. As the dominion grew wealthy and secure, traditional religious beliefs came under pressure from new ideas, imported from subject territories and allied powers. Solar worship, always important in royal ideology, began to eclipse the traditional pantheon of local deities. Foreign gods, like the Asiatic Reshef and the Nubian Dedon, found places in traditional temples. Most significantly, the concept of a universal deity who ruled all peoples, not just the valley civilization, began to appeal to leaders of a universal dominion. These religious tensions erupted into open revolution when Amenhotep III's son assumed power. Initially ruling as Amenhotep IV, he began his reign conventionally enough, completing his father's building projects and maintaining traditional religious practices. But within a few years, he had embarked on the most radical transformation in 3 millennia of continuous civilization. The revolutionary sovereign changed his name to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, and proclaimed that the solar disk, the Aten, was the only true god. All other deities were declared false, their temples closed, their images destroyed. For the first time in human history, a leader attempted to impose monotheism on an entire civilization through royal decree. The religious revolution was accompanied by equally radical changes in art, architecture, and even the location of the capital. Akhenaten abandoned Thebes with its powerful priesthood of Amun and built an entirely new city at what is now called Amarna. Here, in temples open to the sky, the royal family worshipped the sun disk in ceremonies that broke with every convention of traditional religious practice. Amarna art, commissioned to decorate the new capital, departed dramatically from the formal conventions that had governed artistic expression for millennia. Instead of the idealized, eternal figures of traditional sculpture, Akhenaten commissioned portraits that showed him with elongated skull, feminine hips, and prominent belly. Royal family scenes depicted intimate moments, the sovereign kissing his wife, playing with his daughters, that would have been unthinkable in earlier periods. But the revolution that began with such promise ended in disaster. The religious changes alienated the powerful priesthood that had supported central administration for generations. The diplomatic correspondence from Amarna reveals a dominion in crisis as governors pleaded for armed assistance that never came. The Hittites, recognizing weakness, launched campaigns that conquered much of the Syrian territory that Thutmose III had spent decades securing. Most fatally, Akhenaten's religious obsessions distracted him from the practical business of international management. Provincial rebellions went uncrushed, tributary payments went uncollected, and allied leaders began to doubt whether their protector could still protect them. The vast territories that had taken centuries to build began to collapse within a single generation. When Akhenaten died around 1336, the establishment moved quickly to restore traditional order. His young son-in-law, initially called Tutankhaten, changed his name to Tutankhamun and abandoned the heretical capital for Memphis and Thebes. The boy's sovereign, probably no more than 9 years old when he assumed power, became the face of traditional restoration, even as real authority rested with military commanders and senior administrators. Tutankhamun's brief reign, he died around age 19, accomplished the essential task of religious restoration. The Aten temples were closed, Amun's worship was re-established, and the traditional priesthood regained their authority. But the vast territories remained weak and divided, their Syrian provinces largely lost, their administrative system disrupted by a decade of religious chaos. The generals who had managed the restoration soon claimed power directly. Possibly Tutankhamun's grandfather, ruled briefly before being overthrown by Horemheb, the army commander who had maintained order while royal attention was distracted by religious revolution. Horemheb's 18-year reign completed the counter-revolution, systematically destroying every trace of Akhenaten's religious experiment and restoring the international system to its traditional foundations. But true restoration required more than religious orthodoxy. It demanded military leadership capable of reconquering lost territories and intimidating potential enemies. That leadership came with the 19th lineage, established by the first Rameses, a military commander chosen by Horemheb as his successor. The first Ramesses' son, Seti I, launched the campaigns that re-established authority in the Levant. His war reliefs at Karnak show him capturing fortified cities, defeating coalition armies, and receiving the submission of local chiefs who had thought themselves free of traditional control. More importantly, his campaigns demonstrated to the Hittite state that the ancient valley civilization had recovered from its period of weakness and was once again a formidable opponent. But the defining figure of this restoration was Seti's son, the second Rameses, who would rule for 66 years and transform himself into the most famous monarch in history. This second Rameses understood that successful international dominance required not just military achievement, but constant propaganda that made enemies fear royal power and subjects reverence divine greatness. The Battle of Kadesh, fought in his 5th regnal year against the Hittite army and its allies, became the centerpiece of this propaganda campaign. The second Ramesses' version of events, carved on temple walls throughout the Dominion, describes a heroic personal victory against overwhelming odds. The sovereign, abandoned by his cowardly troops, single-handedly charges the entire enemy army and drives them from the field. The reality, revealed by both Hittite records and careful analysis of the battle accounts, was more complex. The second Ramesses fell into a carefully prepared ambush that nearly destroyed his army and probably should have ended his reign. Only the arrival of reinforcements and Hittite reluctance to pursue their advantage allowed the forces to escape with their lives. The battle was, at best, a draw that left both powers exhausted and ready for peace. But the second Ramesses transformed this near disaster into a propaganda masterpiece that enhanced rather than diminished his reputation. The peace treaty he negotiated with the Hittites 16 years later, the world's first documented international agreement, was presented not as a compromise between equals, but as the submission of enemies to divine greatness. The monuments this second Ramesses built to commemorate his reign dwarf those of any predecessor. Abu Simbel, carved into the cliffs overlooking the sacred waterway near the Second Cataract, features 4 seated colossi of the monarch, each 65 feet tall, flanking a temple decorated with scenes of his victories. The building was positioned so that twice each year, on his birthday and coronation day, the rising sun would penetrate the temple's depths to illuminate statues of the sovereign and the gods in the innermost sanctuary. At Thebes, this second Ramesses added massive courts and halls to Karnak temple and built his own mortuary temple, the Ramesseum, decorated with the largest and most detailed account of the Kadesh battle. Throughout the Dominion, from Nubia to the Lebanese coast, his monuments proclaim divine glory and royal authority to subjects who might otherwise forget their obligations to distant leaders. But perhaps this second Ramesses' most important legacy was the workers' village of Deir el-Medina, where the artisans who decorated royal tombs lived and worked for generations. The thousands of ostraca, inscribed pottery shards and limestone flakes, discovered there provide an unparalleled glimpse into daily life during the expansionist age. We see skilled craftsmen organizing strikes when their food rations were delayed, women managing household finances and property, children learning to read and write in schools attached to local temples. These records reveal that prosperity extended far beyond the royal court. The farmers, artisans, and administrators who supported the international system enjoyed living standards that would not be matched in most parts of the world for another 2 millennia. Literacy was widespread, medical care was sophisticated, and social mobility allowed talented individuals to rise from humble origins to positions of real authority. But the very success of the second Ramesses' reign created problems for his successors. His longevity, he ruled until he was over 90, meant that several generations grew up knowing no other sovereign. When he finally died around 1213, the succession fell to his 13th son, Meneptah, who was already elderly and faced the challenge of matching an impossible legacy. Meneptah's reign was dominated by crises that revealed how much the world had changed during his father's long rule. The Sea Peoples, mysterious maritime raiders whose origins remain debated, launched devastating attacks on coastal cities throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Hittite power collapsed under their assault, leaving a vacuum that allowed local chiefs in the Levant to reassert their independence. Even the heartland came under attack as Libyan tribes, displaced by drought and population pressure, invaded the Western territories. Meneptah's victory over these Libyan invaders was the last great triumph of the expansionist age. His victory stela, carved at Thebes, contains the earliest known reference to Israel among the peoples of the Levant. But by then, the vast dominion was already beginning the long decline that would end its international dominance forever. The final phase of international glory came under the third Rameses, the last great warrior sovereign who faced an even more serious invasion by the Sea Peoples around 1180. These mysterious raiders had already destroyed the Hittite state and most of the coastal cities of the Levant. They came not just as warriors, but as entire populations seeking new homes, bringing their families and possessions in ox-drawn carts while their fleets attacked from the sea. The Battle of the Delta, recorded in detailed reliefs at Medinet Habu, shows the third Ramesses' forces fighting desperately to prevent the invaders from establishing permanent settlements in the heartland. The royal archers, positioned behind wooden fortifications, rain arrows on the enemy ships, while infantry forces engaged the invaders on land. The victory was complete. The Sea Peoples were driven off and the kingdom saved. But the cost was enormous. More ominously, the Harris Papyrus, a detailed economic document from the end of the third Ramesses' reign, reveals a dominion in financial crisis. Temple estates had grown so large that they controlled more wealth than the royal treasury. Corruption was endemic, with officials embezzling funds intended for public works and armed expeditions. Even the workers who built royal tombs went on strike when their food rations were diverted to private profit. The vast territories that had once dominated the known world were consuming themselves from within. Provincial governors ruled their regions like independent sovereigns, remitting tribute only when forced to do so. Nubian gold production declined as mines were exhausted and security deteriorated. Trade networks that had once brought exotic goods from across the known world contracted as political instability made long-distance commerce too dangerous to pursue. By the death of the third Ramesses around 1155, the great age of expansion was ending. His successors, a series of monarchs all bearing the same royal name, but possessing none of his military skill or political authority, presided over the gradual dissolution of the territories their predecessors had built. The Levantine provinces were lost to local chiefs and new international powers. Nubian governors declared their independence. Even in the heartland, royal authority extended little beyond the immediate vicinity of the capital. As the last great sovereign's tomb was sealed in the Valley of the Monarchs, the age of international dominance gave way to an era of division and decline. But the monuments they left behind would ensure that their achievements would never be entirely forgotten. The silence that settled over Thebes after the third Ramesses' funeral was different from the reverent quiet of previous royal burials. This was the silence of abandonment. The great capital that had commanded tribute from Nubia to the Euphrates found itself ruling little more than the immediate countryside. The vast administrative apparatus that had once governed an international dominion contracted to managing local temple estates and collecting taxes from increasingly reluctant farmers. Power, like water finding its level, flowed to whoever could claim it effectively. In the north, at Tanis in the eastern delta, a family of military commanders established what they called the 21st dynasty. These were practical men who understood that the age of foreign conquest was over and that survival required adapting to new realities. They ruled efficiently over the productive agricultural regions of lower territories, maintaining trade connections with the Mediterranean world and accumulating impressive wealth despite their reduced circumstances. But Tanis faced a problem that would define this entire age: legitimacy. The northern commanders might control the richest agricultural lands and the most important trade routes, but they possessed no connection to the ancient religious traditions that made kingship meaningful. They were successful warlords ruling territories they had seized, not divinely appointed sovereigns governing subjects who accepted their authority. True religious legitimacy remained in Thebes, where the high priests of Amun had accumulated both spiritual authority and temporal power during the chaos of the late 20th dynasty. These priests controlled the vast temple estates that covered much of upper territories, commanded the loyalty of local populations who revered Amun above any earthly sovereign, and possessed the ritual knowledge necessary to maintain the cosmic order that kept the universe functioning. The result was an unprecedented division of authority. Tanis controlled the political and economic resources necessary for effective government, while Thebes possessed the religious prestige that made such government legitimate. Neither could destroy the other without destroying the foundations of their own power, so they coexisted in an uneasy balance that lasted for over a century. This division reflected deeper changes in society and culture. The rigid centralization that had characterized the new kingdom gave way to a more federal system where local authorities exercised considerable independence. Provincial temples, enriched by royal donations during the expansionist age, became centers of regional power with their own administrative systems and economic networks. Wealthy merchants and landowners, no longer dependent on royal favor for their prosperity, began to challenge traditional social hierarchies. Most significantly, foreigners who had once been subjects or allies began asserting their own claims to leadership. In the Western territories, Libyan tribes that had been settled as military colonists during the New Kingdom gradually rose to positions of authority. Their chiefs intermarried with local noble families, adopted traditional titles and religious practices, and slowly transformed themselves from foreign mercenaries into legitimate regional governors. The process culminated around 945, when Shoshenq the, a Libyan chief who had served as military commander under the last Tanite sovereign, simply declared himself pharaoh and established the 22nd dynasty. His coup was remarkably bloodless. The existing administrative system continued functioning. Religious ceremonies proceeded without interruption, and most officials retained their positions under the new regime. Shoshenq Kodyai understood that successful usurpation required not just seizing power, but demonstrating its effective use. His solution was brilliant in its simplicity. He would revive the military glory of the new kingdom through a spectacular foreign campaign that would remind both subjects and neighbors of traditional greatness. His target was the wealthy kingdoms of Palestine and Syria, now weakened by the collapse of their former protectors. The campaign, launched around 925, was a masterpiece of logistics and propaganda. Shoshenq's forces swept through Palestine, capturing Jerusalem and dozens of other fortified cities. The biblical account, which calls him Shishak, describes the terror his appearance caused. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of the homeland, came up against Jerusalem. He took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. But Shoshenq's triumph revealed the limitations of this new age. Unlike the New Kingdom pharaohs who had established permanent control over conquered territories, he was content with a massive raid that captured immediate wealth, but created no lasting dominion. His forces returned home, laden with gold and silver, prisoners and tribute, but they left behind no garrisons, appointed no governors, established no administrative system that could convert military victory into political control. The wealth captured in Palestine funded a building program that decorated temples throughout the homeland with scenes of Shoshenq's victories. At Karnak, his relief shows him smiting enemies before Amun, while the god hands him the sword of victory. Long lists of conquered cities proclaim the restoration of traditional military prowess. But these monuments were propaganda rather than reality. Impressive displays designed to convince viewers that the old greatness had returned when it had merely been briefly simulated. Shoshenq's successors lacked both his military skill and his political acumen. The 22nd dynasty fragmented into competing branches as different members of the Libyan ruling family established rival claims to authority. Some controlled Memphis and the northern territories. Others ruled from Thebes. Still others carved out independent domains in the delta or middle regions. By the 8th century, the unified state had become a patchwork of petty kingdoms whose boundaries shifted with each succession crisis. Into this confusion came a new element that would eventually reunify the fragmented territories: the rise of Nubian power in the south. The Kushite kingdom, centered at Napata near the Fourth Cataract, had been developing its own sophisticated political and religious system throughout the intermediate period. Kushite leaders had adopted traditional religious practices, built temples in classical architectural styles, and created an administrative system modeled on New Kingdom precedents. Most importantly, the Kushite sovereigns had preserved the ideology of divine kingship more faithfully than their northern contemporaries. While Libyan chieftains ruled as successful warlords who happened to bear pharaonic titles, the Kushite leaders genuinely believed themselves to be divinely appointed guardians of Ma'at, cosmic order, and traditional religious practices. They saw the political fragmentation of the north as evidence of divine displeasure, and their own rise as a mandate to restore proper governance. The Kushite advance northward was gradual but inexorable. Piye, greatest of the Nubian sovereigns, spent decades extending his authority over upper territories through a combination of military pressure and religious appeal. His victory, Stella, discovered at Jebel Barkal, provides the most detailed account of political and military activity from this entire period. The document reveals Piye as a sophisticated political operator who understood that lasting conquest required more than military victory. When rebel chiefs submitted to his authority, he confirmed them in their positions rather than replacing them with Kushite appointees. When cities surrendered without resistance, he spared their populations and protected their property. When temples welcomed his forces, he made generous donations and participated in traditional ceremonies that demonstrated his religious orthodoxy. But Piye also understood that mercy required the backdrop of credible force. Cities that resisted faced systematic siege warfare, conducted with a professionalism that recalled the great conquerors of the New Kingdom. His description of the siege of Memphis reads like a military manual. Then he sent forth his fleet and his army to assault Memphis. They captured its harbor. They brought away its ships. They captured all the people who approached Memphis. The psychological impact of Kushite military efficiency was enormous. Northern chiefs who had grown accustomed to the ritualized warfare of the intermediate period found themselves facing opponents who fought with deadly seriousness and possessed the organizational skills necessary to conduct prolonged campaigns. City after city submitted rather than endure siege by forces that clearly possessed both the will and capability to destroy determined resistance. By 728, Piye controlled virtually all territory south of Memphis. But rather than complete his conquest by seizing the delta regions, he chose to return to Napata, content with acknowledgement of his supremacy over the traditional heartland. This decision reflected both the practical limitations of Kushite power and the ideological constraints of divine kingship. Peyer saw himself as a restorer of traditional order rather than a foreign conqueror, and traditional order required ruling from the ancestral centers of pharaonic authority. The northern chiefs, left to their own devices, quickly resumed their petty conflicts and factional struggles. But now they faced a new threat that would force even the most fractious local warlords to seek external protection: the rise of Assyrian power in Mesopotamia. The Assyrian military machine, perfected through centuries of constant warfare, was expanding westward into Syria and Palestine with a systematic brutality that made all previous conquerors seem gentle by comparison. The Assyrian approach to conquest was fundamentally different from traditional methods. Where previous invaders had been content to receive tribute and acknowledgement of supremacy, the Assyrians sought total control through the systematic destruction of local cultures and the mass deportation of populations. Their siege techniques could reduce the strongest fortifications to rubble. Their administrative system could transform conquered territories into Assyrian provinces. Most terrifyingly, their ideological commitment to expansion seemed to recognize no natural limits. As Assyrian forces conquered Syria and advanced toward the traditional border regions, the northern chiefs faced an impossible choice: submit to foreign domination, more complete than anything they had ever experienced, or seek protection from the only power capable of challenging Assyrian military supremacy. Reluctantly, they turned south to the Kushite sovereigns, who had demonstrated their military effectiveness against traditional forces, but remained committed to preserving rather than destroying local traditions. Shabaka, Payer's successor, responded to these appeals by completing the conquest his predecessor had begun. Around 715, Kushite forces occupied Memphis and the Delta, establishing direct control over the entire traditional territory for the first time in over 3 centuries. But Shabaka's unification was defensive rather than aggressive, a response to external threat rather than internal ambition. The Kushite pharaohs, who ruled from Memphis during the 25th dynasty, proved remarkably successful at restoring traditional government and religious practices. They repaired temples that had been neglected during the intermediate period, re-established administrative systems that had fallen into disuse, and revived artistic and architectural traditions that connected their reign to the glorious precedents of earlier ages. Taharqa, greatest of the Kushite sovereigns, ruled for 26 years and demonstrated that foreign origin was no barrier to effective traditional kingship. His building projects rivaled those of the New Kingdom pharaohs. His military campaigns extended influence into Palestine and Syria, and his religious activities earned the devotion of priesthoods throughout the territory. Under his leadership, the reunified state briefly reclaimed something approaching its former international prestige. But the Assyrian threat that had enabled Kushite unification ultimately proved insurmountable. Esarhaddon's invasion in 674 was repelled, but his second campaign in 671 succeeded in capturing Memphis and forcing Taharqa to flee south to Thebes. The Assyrian occupation was brief but devastating. The invaders systematically looted temples, deported skilled craftsmen, and appointed local collaborators to administer territories they could not effectively garrison. Taharqa's attempts to reclaim the northern territories through alliance with Palestinian rebels only invited more massive Assyrian retaliation. Ashurbanipal's campaigns in 667 and 663 were conducted with a brutality designed to discourage future resistance. When Thebes finally fell to Assyrian forces in 663, the ancient capital was systematically destroyed in a sack so complete that it became a byword for devastation throughout the ancient world. The prophet Nahum, writing decades later, could still invoke the fate of Thebes as the ultimate example of divine judgment. Are you better than Thebes that sat by the waterway, surrounded by water, whose rampart was the sea, water her wall? Yet she was carried away. She went into captivity. Her infants were dashed in pieces at the head of every street. For her honored men they cast lots, and all her great men were bound in chains. The Kushite retreat to Napata marked the end of the last attempt to restore traditional greatness through foreign leadership. The 25th dynasty had demonstrated that military effectiveness and religious orthodoxy could still command respect and loyalty. But they had also revealed the impossibility of maintaining independence in a world dominated by Mesopotamian superpowers, whose resources and organizational capabilities dwarfed those of any traditional African state. The Assyrian withdrawal, when it came, was caused not by local resistance, but by political crises in Mesopotamia that required the recall of forces from distant provinces. But the brief occupation had shattered the illusion that traditional military methods could compete with the systematic warfare of the new international age. The ancient territory emerged from Assyrian domination, politically fragmented, economically devastated, and psychologically traumatized by the realization of its own vulnerability. Local chieftains who had collaborated with the Assyrians found themselves ruling territories whose populations despised them as traitors, but whose conquerors had withdrawn beyond recall. Traditional authorities, who had maintained loyalty to the Kushite sovereigns, discovered that their principles had retreated beyond the reach of effective support. Religious institutions that had preserved cultural continuity through previous periods of political chaos found their accumulated wealth looted and their traditional practices disrupted. Yet even in this apparent ending, new forms of political organization were emerging that would eventually restore some measure of unity and prosperity. The trauma of foreign occupation had demonstrated the inadequacy of traditional methods, but it had also revealed possibilities for adaptation and renewal that would inspire the next chapter in the long story of civilization along the sacred waterway. From the ashes of Assyrian devastation rose an unlikely phoenix. In the western delta city of Sais, a family of local administrators who had served the Mesopotamian occupiers began to envision something unprecedented: the restoration of ancient greatness through deliberate imitation of the distant past. Psamtik I, founder of the 26th dynasty around 664, understood that legitimacy in this shattered world required not innovation, but the resurrection of traditions so ancient they seemed eternal. The site renaissance, as scholars would later call it, was archaeology as political program. Psamtik's artisans studied Old Kingdom reliefs with scholarly precision, copying poses, proportions, and stylistic details that had not been used for 15 centuries. His architects rebuilt temples according to plans preserved in ancient archives, recreating sacred spaces that connected the present to the mythical golden age when divine sovereigns had ruled an undivided realm. But this was no mere antiquarian exercise. Psamtik possessed the political genius to understand that successful restoration required adapting ancient forms to contemporary realities. While his monuments proclaimed continuity with the pyramid builders, his administration employed Greek mercenaries, Phoenician traders, and Mesopotamian diplomatic practices. The challenge was to appear legitimately ancient, while remaining practically effective in a world that had changed beyond recognition. The process of reunification took decades and required careful balance between multiple competing forces. Assyrian withdrawal had left a power vacuum, but it had also created opportunities for ambitious local leaders throughout the valley. Psamtik's strategy was to co-opt rather than conquer these rivals, offering them positions in his expanding administration while gradually extending his authority through marriage alliances, religious appointments, and economic incentives. The key breakthrough came with his control of Thebes and the appointment of his daughter Nitocris as divine adoratress of Amun. This ancient office, which had evolved during the intermediate period into a form of female rulership over upper territories, provided Psamtik with religious legitimacy that no military conquest could have achieved. When the aged Kushite princess who held the position adopted Nitocris as her successor, the transition effectively ended Nubian claims to traditional authority. The adoption ceremony, recorded in detailed inscriptions at Karnak, reveals the sophisticated political theatre that characterized Saite governance. Nitocris arrived in Thebes with a fleet of ships laden with gold, silver, and precious goods, a demonstration of northern wealth, designed to impress local populations who had suffered through decades of political chaos and economic decline. Her formal adoption by the Kushite princess legitimized the transfer of power, while allowing the previous regime to retire with dignity rather than face military defeat. Under Saite rule, the reunified territories experienced a remarkable cultural and economic revival. The ancient capital at Memphis was rebuilt and repopulated. Irrigation systems that had fallen into disrepair during the intermediate period were restored and expanded. Trade networks that had contracted during the Assyrian occupation were re-established, connecting the valley to Mediterranean markets and bringing unprecedented prosperity to merchant communities throughout the realm. The Saite pharaohs proved especially adept at managing the cultural tensions created by increasing foreign presence in their territories. Greek traders and mercenaries, attracted by economic opportunities and political stability, established permanent communities in the Delta cities. Rather than resist this immigration, the Saite administration channeled it productively, granting the Greeks their own quarter in the city of Naucratis, while requiring them to conduct all trade through official channels that ensured royal revenues. This controlled cosmopolitanism produced remarkable cultural innovations. Greek artistic techniques influenced traditional sculpture and painting, creating hybrid styles that combined classical proportions with ancient iconography. Foreign religious practices were integrated into local ceremonies, expanding the pantheon without challenging fundamental theological principles. Most significantly, the Greek alphabet was adapted for writing the local language, creating the demotic script that would eventually replace hieroglyphs for everyday purposes. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited during this period, left detailed descriptions of a society that seemed to him both fascinatingly ancient and surprisingly sophisticated. His accounts of mummification procedures, religious festivals, and daily customs provide invaluable insights into a civilization that was consciously preserving its traditions while adapting to contemporary realities. His wonder at the pyramids and temples reflects the awe that these monuments still inspired, even among visitors from the most advanced Mediterranean cultures. But the Saite achievement contained the seeds of its own destruction. The very success of the restoration attracted the attention of the Persian Empire, the latest and greatest of the Mesopotamian superpowers. Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, recognized that control of the wealthy valley territories would provide both enormous resources and strategic control over the eastern Mediterranean trade routes. The Persian invasion of 525 was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Cambyses understood that traditional military tactics had evolved to counter conventional armies, so he employed methods specifically designed to exploit local religious sensibilities. At the Battle of Pelusium, his forces allegedly drove cats, ibises, and other sacred animals before their advancing lines. knowing that defenders would be reluctant to harm creatures sacred to their gods. Whether this account is literally accurate or merely symbolic, it captures the fundamental challenge that Persian conquest represented. The Persians fought not just to defeat armies, but to shatter the religious and cultural assumptions that gave their enemies the will to resist. Their victory was so complete that Psamtik III, last of the Saite pharaohs, was captured alive and forced to witness the execution of his son before being taken in chains to Persia. Persian rule, formalized as the 27th dynasty, proved surprisingly adaptable to local conditions. Cambyses and his successors understood that effective governance of the valley territories required respecting, rather than destroying, the religious and administrative traditions that made the region governable. They adopted traditional royal titles, participated in ancient ceremonies, and maintained the temple estates that provided both religious legitimacy and economic productivity. Darius I, greatest of the Persian administrators, demonstrated this pragmatic approach through massive infrastructure projects that benefited local populations while serving imperial interests. His completion of the canal connecting the valley to the Red Sea created new trade opportunities that enriched both Persian treasury and local merchants. His legal reforms, recorded in both Persian and Demotic scripts, showed respect for traditional law while integrating local practices into the imperial administrative system. But Persian rule, however enlightened, remained foreign domination that many traditional elites found intolerable. The first serious rebellion erupted in 486 under Qababash, a native leader who claimed descent from the ancient pharaohs and promised to restore traditional independence. Although quickly suppressed, this revolt established a pattern of periodic uprisings that would weaken Persian control and eventually enable successful liberation movements. The crucial rebellion came under Emirtius around 404, taking advantage of Persian distraction by Greek wars and internal succession disputes. This Scythe prince managed to establish the brief 28th dynasty and maintain independence for 6 years before Persian forces could be spared for reconquest. His success demonstrated that Persian power, however imposing, was not invincible when stretched across vast distances and multiple fronts. The 30th royal line, established by Nectanebo I around 380, represented the last flowering of native rule and ancestral culture. These final pharaohs understood that independence required not just military success, but diplomatic sophistication that could exploit the complex international situation created by Persian-Greek conflicts. They allied with Athens against Persia, hired Greek mercenaries to supplement traditional forces, and built fortifications using the latest military engineering techniques. Nectanebo II, last of the native pharaohs, ruled for 18 years and presided over a remarkable cultural renaissance that consciously echoed the greatest achievements of earlier ages. His building projects at temples throughout the valley demonstrated both the wealth accumulated during the independence period and the determination to maintain traditional religious practices despite constant external pressure. But this final independence was ultimately doomed by the same forces that had enabled it. The Persian Empire, having finally defeated Greek resistance, could once again devote full attention to reconquering rebellious provinces. Artaxerxes III's invasion in 343 was conducted with systematic brutality, designed to discourage future revolts. Nectanebo II fled to Nubia, ending over 3 millennia of continuous native rule, and the Persians established the 31st dynasty with administrative practices specifically designed to prevent future uprisings. The Second Persian occupation proved brief but devastating. Determined to prevent another successful rebellion, The occupiers systematically looted temple treasuries, deported skilled craftsmen, and destroyed fortifications that had enabled previous resistance movements. The cultural and economic damage was so severe that when Alexander of Macedon arrived in 332, he found a population ready to welcome any liberator who could promise protection from Persian vengeance. Alexander's conquest was unlike any previous foreign invasion. The young Macedonian presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator sent by the gods to restore traditional order and drive out the hated Persians. His pilgrimage to the oracle of Amun at Siwa, where he was reportedly proclaimed the god's son, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of local religious sensibilities and political requirements. More importantly, Alexander possessed a vision of cultural synthesis that offered something unprecedented: the possibility of preserving traditional identity within a cosmopolitan international system. His foundation of Alexandria at the mouth of the Western Branch demonstrated this vision in practical form: a city that would be simultaneously Greek and local, international and traditional, a bridge between the ancient valley civilization and the wider Mediterranean world. Alexander's death in 323 led to the division of his empire among his generals, with Ptolemy I claiming the valley territories and establishing the dynasty that would rule for the next 3 centuries. The early Macedonian pharaohs proved remarkably successful at adapting their administrative techniques to local conditions while maintaining the cultural synthesis that Alexander had initiated. The great achievement of this Hellenistic period was the Museum and Library of Alexandria, which became the greatest center of learning in the ancient world. Here, scholars from across the Mediterranean gathered to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy using both Greek methods and ancestral knowledge preserved in ancient texts. The translation of religious and scientific literature into Greek made this accumulated wisdom available to international scholarship, while ensuring its preservation for future generations. But perhaps the most significant innovation was the creation of a truly bilingual culture that operated effectively in both Greek and native languages. The Rosetta Stone, created during the reign of Ptolemy V, exemplifies this achievement. A royal decree published in hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek scripts that demonstrates the administrative sophistication necessary to govern a multicultural population. This Hellenistic system enabled remarkable prosperity and cultural achievement for over 2 centuries. Alexandria became the largest city in the Mediterranean, its harbors filled with ships from across the known world, its streets crowded with merchants, scholars, and artisans from dozens of different cultures. The wealth generated by this international trade funded both military forces capable of defending independence and cultural projects that enhanced the royal house's prestige throughout the Hellenistic world. But this achievement was ultimately undermined by the same forces that destroyed every previous attempt at independence: the rise of a new superpower whose resources and organizational capabilities dwarfed those of any regional state. The Roman Republic, having conquered the Western Mediterranean, gradually extended its influence eastward through a combination of military intervention and diplomatic manipulation that made formal conquest unnecessary until the very end. The last pharaoh, Cleopatra VII, understood that independence required not just domestic legitimacy, but international alliances capable of balancing Roman power. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony represented sophisticated attempts to preserve autonomy through partnership with Roman leaders who possessed both the resources and the motivation to maintain a balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC marked the end not just of Ptolemaic rule, but of the ancient independence that had endured, with brief interruptions for over 3 millennia. Octavian's victory over Antony and Cleopatra was so complete that no subsequent attempt at restoration would ever be possible. When Cleopatra died by her own hand, rather than face the humiliation of appearing in a Roman triumph, she ended the last chapter of a story that had begun with the unification of the two lands under Narmer. The sacred valley that had given birth to pyramid builders, temple architects, and divine sovereigns became a Roman province, its wealth flowing north to fund imperial projects in distant lands, its ancient traditions preserved only in temples, maintained for their tourist value rather than their religious significance.